I'm actually going to say off the bat that I think 300 is an incredible movie. I love 300. The minute that I say that, I'm sure that many people are going to become like that actually guy on the internet who says like, but Spencer, there are a lot of historical inaccuracies in the movie 300. Actually, yes, true, correct. Yes, I'm going to get to those. I'm going to get to the historical inaccuracies. I'm going to get to why I don't care about them in a sec. And in point of fact, this is not actually going to be an episode about the movie 300 so much as it's going to be an episode about the Battle of Thermopylae and even also the Battle of Marathon. And specifically about the way that Herodotus, who is the first great historian of the West, and really the father of history, as he was famously called, the first historian of the West, and the great historian of the Persian Wars, the way that he tells these stories. And in the course of describing that, I want to make an argument for 300 as one of the best adaptations of classical history in my lifetime. And that does not mean that I think 300 is where you should go to learn about what happened at the Battle of Thermopylae. Like, that is not what I'm saying here at all. And I actually believe strongly that everybody should study the history of Thermopylae. It's one of the great events in all of world history and all of Western history. It's probably one of the top 5 or 10 events that I would say, even if you're not a history buff, you need to know about the Battle of Thermopylae. And I don't think that the way you should do that is by going and watching 300. I think it's that you should go and read Herodotus. But I am going to argue that once you've read Herodotus and as you get to know about this battle, 300 is a damn good adjunct. It's a damn good way of connecting to this battle. And even watching it before you do Herodotus is a damn good way of getting interested in the whole thing and the situation that the Greeks were in and why they fought the way they did and what they were fighting for. And it's particularly important for me to say that right now, I think, because currently, and since it was made, really, 300 has been tarred as some kind of like white supremacist propaganda, which is absolute garbage. It's so nonsense. But it's nonsense of the kind that we often mention on this show by way of dismissing it, right? You have to be aware of this stuff in order to know what it is and why it is ridiculous and can be shrugged off. So people really, really hate this movie, and not just the people that think it's historically inaccurate, right? Here are some just, brief summary of some headlines about it. From the AV Club, Zack Snyder's 300 presaged the howling fascism of the alt-right. The howling fascism! Howling, I tell you! And The Guardian called it a racist gore fest, yeah? Interestingly, Donna Zuckerberg, who is the sister of Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook fame, and the self-appointed, she has an absolutely dreadful book, which you should look up my review of. It's called The West and the Woke, and it's on Real Clear Books. If you really want to hear me intellectually eviscerate somebody, you should go and read my review of Donna Zuckerberg's book. It's called Not All Dead White Men, but I only raise her now because she has this website, Eidolon, in which she says about the evil alt-rightists whom she hates. She's she's self-appointed as the exposer of all evil alt-right misuses, misappropriations of classical history. And she says their vision of Sparta owes more to 300 than actual Spartan history. This word misappropriation is a great way that you can clue into the fact that somebody's doing more than just commenting on historical inaccuracy. Misappropriation is a word that people use when they mean, how dare these conservatives take ownership of ancient history? How dare we look to the past, not just as a set of facts about what happened, not just as something to critique and deconstruct, but as something to own and celebrate with unapologetic delight and relish. And that's what people hate about the movie 300. It's because of its complete balls to the wall celebration of this incredible moment in history, this untellable, unspeakable act of bravery committed by these 300 Spartans, this self-sacrifice in the name of slowing down the Persian hordes as they traveled southward in their invasion of Greece. And that's the story that we're here to tell. I'm going to talk about, first of all and foremost, about how Herodotus tells that story, why he tells it the way he does. And then we'll get into a little bit of what 300 is and why it is the kind of movie that it is. The point of all of this, the point of the whole episode is first of all going to be that there is value in not just telling history, but celebrating history and choosing important moments to really lionize. And this is a little bit more complicated, history is more than just facts. It's not just about facts. It's also about glory. And the minute I say that, I can hear all kinds of objections in my head that I bet people are making. And some of them, I think, some people get antsy when I say this for good reason. And that is because there is a distinct anti-fact problem in our academy and in the upper crusts of our society more generally. And this owes a lot to postmodernism, to people like Foucault and Derrida, who believed basically that all arguments are just word games, not really related to any stable truth. What is truth really? Is there such a thing? Yeah, this hyper-skeptical attitude. And the minute you say that history is about more than facts, it's also about storytelling and narrative and glory, you may well be thinking, but Spencer, doesn't that doom you to living in this post-truth society that the postmodernists want and believe is the truth, the real thing, you know? And my answer to that is no. No, it doesn't. Because what I did not say is that facts don't matter or that there's no such thing as facts. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is there's more to history than that. There's more in addition to just this person went here and did that. There's also what it was like. There's the character of it. There's what it was like to be there. And this actually strikes at the heart of who Herodotus was and how he wrote and why. You know, they say facts don't care about your feelings. Benjamin says facts don't care about your feelings. This is kind of like a little footnote to that. But also, your feelings are facts, and some feelings, some emotional interactions with the world, some emotional experiences of events have something to tell you about what those events are that is more than just their material facticity, just like X happened at Y time and Z person did it. Like that kind of bare bones fact is not the full picture. So I'm going to talk about how Herodotus gets there in a sec. But first, I'm going to pause, and I'm going to thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening. I'm really glad you're here. And every time I say this, I say it to more people, which is exciting. And the people that I say it to are so interesting. I'm so interested to hear from you guys. You are so, I tweeted about this earlier. You know, you are homeschool teachers, you are firefighters, you are farmers, you are college professors, everything in the world, it seems, people who have found the show. And it's great to talk to you. If you're new, welcome. Welcome to Young Heretics. This is my passion project. I love to do it. I love to have you here. Please subscribe wherever you're listening to it right now. Just hit the subscribe button. You will get a new episode every week. And each one is on a different topic or work. And we hope that you will love them. We love making them. And if you really want to help the show out, go ahead and leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. Those are particularly helpful. And tell everybody that you know who might like the show, or anybody that even might just vaguely be interested to know that the show exists. Tell everybody. All right. Thanks for being here. Glad you're here. Let's talk about Herodotus. This is a guy who is writing about history that exists in living memory in many cases. In some cases, he reaches way, way back into the distant past. But the core of his history, and it's just called, Herodotus history or histories. The core of his history is about stuff that happened in living memory. In some cases, about stuff that happened while he was alive. So he was born around in the 480s BC. We're not totally clear on just when exactly, but the ancient tradition holds he's born around, maybe 485 or so. And so this is just after the first Persian invasion of Greece that he's born. It's 490 when Darius, the Persian king, invaded Greece for the first time. We've talked about this before on this show, but just as a refresher, right? That's the first invasion, 490. Herodotus is born, and then probably after he's born, but only a little bit, and maybe even not after, but right when he's born, there's a second invasion with Xerxes, the son of Darius, who invades in 480. And that invasion, the Xerxes invasion, is when the Battle of Thermopylae happens, and that's what happens in the movie 300. So 300 takes place in the second Persian invasion. But we're talking today about both of them because Herodotus talks about both of them. And indeed, he talks about much, much more than just these two major kind of set-piece encounters between Greeks and Persians. He goes way back into the origins of both of these cultures and how they developed and how they came to be at odds with one another and so forth. And we are not today going to talk about the full scope of Herodotus' narrative. But we are going to talk about what kind of a narrative it is. This guy Herodotus is from Halicarnassus, Herodotus of Halicarnassus, which is in what's now Turkey, Asia Minor. But it's a Greek city. And remember that at this point, and leading up to this point, Greece, so to speak, is not like the country that we now think of it as. And it's not even the sort of united coalitions of allied city-states that it will eventually become during Herodotus' lifetime. But it is a collection of people who share a language, broadly speaking, and form all of these little tribal or city-state level governments and coalitions. And that's what Greece is at the time that it first gets invaded by Persia. And its response to the Persian invasion is in many ways its impetus to gather into something more than that. And many of the city-states become what they are in that conflict with Persia. But Herodotus is born, at least, in the east of that region where these Greek-speaking peoples live. And there were many such places, and many of them were, as they say, Medized. That is, they became little tribute states, or they became owned by and obedient to the Persian Empire. And one consequence of that is that Greece itself, in its inception, is conflicted between whether they're going to be independent people, whether they're going to have what is sometimes called isonomia, which is equality, something, I mean, we might translate it now as equality of rights under the law, although it's not quite that, but it's, equal equality with among citizens and with others, as compared to being vassals, being obedient to a kind of foreign Persian, this massive Persian bureaucracy which sends its satraps out to kind of govern all over this, all over the Middle East and stretching out into the Mediterranean. And so these Eastern Greek states in Asia Minor and kind of up around that area to the north and the east are always in this contentious relationship with Persia. Many of them are under Persian sway. And they, at one point, stage a rebellion. It's sometimes called the Ionian Revolt. And it happens sort of between 499 and 493 BC. And this is a big moment for the Greek city-states that live further to the west, because they too have had this question on the table. Are we going to bend the knee to Persia as it inevitably expands? Because of course Persia is an expansionist empire and believes on some level that it's bringing order to the world, and Darius especially is very good at this, but his predecessor on the throne, Cyrus, was very good at it, at kind of portraying himself as the bringer of order and light and truth to the world, and anybody who is not on board with that project is to be crushed. So the Western Greek city-states have a decision to make. They have a choice to make as Persia's moving outward. And that choice, there's a flashpoint for that choice during the Ionian Revolt, having specifically to do with, are we going to send people, ships, especially for Athens, in Athens' case, are we going to send ships to aid in this revolution against Persia, for Greeks that want to be free? Two important city-states decide that yes, they are going to. One of them is Eretria, which is just across the Euboean Gulf from Athens, very near to Athens. And the other is Athens itself. And the two of them send ships to aid in the revolt. Athens sends 20 ships, famously, 20 triremes. And this is what, ultimately, this is the last straw with Darius, who's not been super favorably disposed toward Athens, even to begin with, up to this point. But now he's really pissed off. And what he does, first and foremost, is he just puts the Ionian Revolt down. And it's devastating. It ends, it doesn't quite end here, but the climactic moment is 494, the sack of Miletus. Miletus is one of these rebellious city-states, and it is devastated. Persia brings down the hammer, Darius brings down the hammer, and Herodotus describes this disaster in some detail. So I'll read first and foremost, Herodotus' description of this disaster. And this, by the way, I'm reading always in this episode from the Landmark Herodotus. The Landmark editions are these big, chunky, beautiful editions, which I had, heard a lot about, but had never actually used for study. And man, they're great. This one is edited by Robert Strassler, and the translation is by Andrea Purvis. The Oxford edition, the Waterfield translation, is also really good. But this just has these maps in it, and copious notes, and really helpful kind of reference throughout. So highly, highly recommend the Landmark editions. They also do a Xenophon and a Thucydides. But here's in book 6, the description of the sack of Miletus. Once, when the Argives were consulting the Delphic oracle concerning the survival of their own city, they received an unusual double oracle, which was not only directed toward the Argives themselves, but which also had an appendix adding advice regarding the Milesians. I shall mention that part of the oracle bearing on the Argives when I come to that episode in my history, but what the oracle advised the Milesians, even though they were not present, was as follows. The time will come, Milesians, devisers of evil deeds, when many will feast on you, a splendid gift for them. Your wives will wash the feet of many long-haired men, and others will assume the care of my own temple at Didyma. That, and this is Herodotus speaking again, that is just what happened now to the Milesians, when the majority of their men were killed by the long-haired Persians, and their women and children became their captive slaves. And at the sanctuary of Didyma, both the temple and the oracle were plundered and set on fire. I have often mentioned the wealth of this sanctuary elsewhere in my history. The Milesians who had been captured alive were taken to Susa. So that's what happens to the Milesians. They are beaten down. Essentially their city is made dust in the face of this encroaching army, and their rebellion is forever quashed. And this is a watershed moment. It is a definitive display of Persian power and of Persian impatience with disobedience. And Athens, which has been involved in this, must take note and does take note. And what's interesting, I mentioned earlier when we did the Aeschylus episode that one of the tragedies before Aeschylus' Persians, which dealt with an historical event, was Phrynichus, the sack of Miletus. And that we get that information from Herodotus, who says that Phrynichus staged this tragedy about this disaster in 492, almost certainly. And the Athenians were so miserable to see this on stage that they fined Phrynichus. So it was a dangerous game, putting on an artistic risk, putting on history. It did not pay off for Phrynichus, understandably so, because at 492, this was still what Darius might do to Athens. So they were looking on stage at the fate suffered by the Milesians, who themselves, had been great allies of theirs. And Herodotus says they were very sad for the Milesians, but of course also they were terrified that this was going to happen to them. And so indeed in 490, right, 490 BC, Darius sends Datis and Artaphernes to crush Athens. And Athens sees this massive encroaching force coming. Athens themselves, at this point, not really a power that feels they can stand on their own. They have usually relied on Sparta, the other, this great military city-state, to help them in war. And so they appeal to Sparta, but Sparta is in the middle of this festival, the Carneia, which is a festival to Apollo Carneus. I've mentioned in other episodes that these different gods, these Greek gods, have different manifestations. The Carneia is this huge, important Spartan festival, and the Spartans are pious, and they will not break their festival. They won't dishonor the festival, even to send forces, even to defend Greece. And they end up arriving too late at the encounter, the grand encounter between the Persians and the Athenians, which is the Battle of Marathon. And like I say, it's devastating to lose the support of Sparta, or just to not have the support of Sparta forthcoming. That is how the Athenians had always defended themselves. And so now they have to send basically their own people. They send 9,000 men plus 1,000 from Plataea, which is in southeastern Boeotia. It's west of Athens. And they go to Marathon, which is this marshy plain in the east. And they choose it, basically, they have hopes of thwarting the Persian cavalry, because the infantry is going to be, again, they're facing down an insane number of forces gathered from this entire multicultural Persian empire. And Herodotus gives figures at Thermopylae for how big the Persian army was that cannot possibly, upwards of 2 million people. It's impossible to imagine that this is accurate. And we're going to get to, all of this. Remember, we're working our way to talking about how Herodotus writes. We're going to get to some of the inaccuracies in Herodotus eventually. But just to note now that this is a huge force. It is resplendent. It's wealthy. It's very well organized bureaucratically. It is driven on by this autocratic tyrant, by this king, Darius, and his, in this case, it's sort of driven on by his underlings, by Datis and Artaphernes. But this is like the scrappy podunk, hometown heroes, this force of 10,000 heading out, and they're doomed. I mean, they surely must feel doomed. They must feel as if this is a hopeless thing. And Herodotus gives his account of the Battle of Marathon. They meet on the plain at Marathon. And here is the account. This is also in Book 6, starting at chapter 112. After the troops were in position, and the sacrifices had proven favorable, when the Athenians were let loose and allowed to advance, they charged at a run toward the barbarians. The space between the two armies was about a mile, and the Persians, who saw the Athenians advancing toward them on the double, prepared to meet their attack. They assumed that the Athenians were seized by some utterly self-destructive madness, as they observed how few the Athenians were in number, and how they were charging toward them with neither cavalry nor archers in support. These are just, hoplite armies, just foot soldiers. So the barbarians suspected that the Athenians had gone mad, but when the Athenians closed with them in combat, they fought remarkably well, for they were the first of all Hellenes we know of to use the running charge against their enemies, as well as the first to endure the sight of the Medes' clothing and the men wearing it. I've never seen people with this kind of get-up, with this regalia, this opulent Eastern clothing, right? In fact, until then, even to hear the name Medes spoken would strike terror into Hellenes, into Greek-speaking peoples, right? They fought in the battle at Marathon for a long time. The barbarians prevailed in the center of the line, where the Persians themselves and the Sakai were deployed. And as the barbarians were winning there, they broke through the line of the Hellenes and chased them inland. But at the same time, the Athenians and Plataeans were prevailing on the wings. In their victory there, they allowed the barbarian troops that they had routed to flee, and then, drawing both of their wings together, they fought those enemy troops who had broken through the center. In this encounter, too, the Athenians were victorious, and as the Persians fled, the Athenians pursued them and cut them down until they reached the sea, where they called for fire and started to seize the ships. What a dramatic tale, right? And Herodotus tells it masterfully. It's vivid. It's right in front of your eyes. Interestingly, Herodotus is renowned in antiquity as well as now for his prose style. And as we'll get to talking more about, there were people who loved him for that and people who took him absolutely to task for that. Somebody who loved him for it was Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who was an essayist on style. And he says that Herodotus is almost a poet. He almost has the kind of mellifluous quality of poetry in his writing. And this, the vividness, which the Greeks would have called enargeia, the seeing it right before your eyes, is part of the quality of his storytelling. And this becomes one of the top, as I've said already, one of the top 5 events, pivotal events, vivid events in Western history. It subsequently proceeds that they literally outrun the Persian ships as the Persians try then to mount an attack by sea, and the Persians have to sail home. 6,400 Persians dead, 120 Greeks, Herodotus tells us. So a tremendous, shocking victory, a complete upset. I've already waxed poetic about just how wild this thing is, but now we're getting, I think, into a little bit more detail than we had before, right? These soldiers were really green, right? They were not trained elite forces, but boy, were they brave, and this has been a model for bravery for us ever since, the outnumbered, disadvantaged forces against the big guy, against the machine guns, right? I mean, to speak analogically, of course, they didn't have machine guns, but against the machine guns, right? Charging into the fray, and just by the sheer force of their grit, turning the thing around. we saw, I think, an example of the spirit of marathon not too long ago here in Los Angeles when 2 cops were shot as they were on patrol. One of those cops, who is a rookie cop, former librarian, mother, Claudia Apolinar, right? She manages to pull her partner to safety while she's suffering from bullet wounds, radio for help, right? That's the spirit of marathon. And we've looked back to it ever since as the exemplar, as the type of that. The thing about ancient warfare, which is kind of makes it exciting, is that you have these set-piece battles that can transform everything. And part of our perception of it that way also comes from Herodotus, who's so good at describing not just the drama on the battlefield, but the consequences of it and the stakes of each fight, right? And this is, and this is one reason why we talked in a previous episode about how war could be this stage for virtue, this testing ground for virtue. One reason why is that these battles were these kind of larger than life unfoldings of conflicts, ideological conflicts, and high stakes games between civilizations that could die or be wiped off the map. Because if the Battle of Marathon had gone differently, there would be no Greece, and there would be no West, and there would be no young heretics, as I said before. This episode is brought to you by the Battle of Marathon, the Battle of Thermopylae, right? All of that stuff would never have been if these battles had gone the other way. And this has been the kind of take on these battles for as long as they have held a place in the Western imagination. John Stuart Mill, who's famous as a kind of advocate of free speech and liberalism, he wrote on liberty, and he wrote in another text, Dissertations and Discussions, 1859. Right? He says, "The Battle of Marathon, even as an event in English history, is more important than the Battle of Hastings." And this is this battle in 1066, which began the Norman conquest of Britain, right? So this pivotal moment in British history. "If the issue of the day had been different, the Britons and the Saxons might still have been wandering in the woods." So he's saying the two sides in this conflict, Britons and Saxons, would never even have developed the civilizations that they did if Marathon had gone differently. And so one reason why we make movies like 300, which again is not about Marathon, but it's about the other kind of big battle that we all remember, Thermopylae. One reason why we make movies like this is because we feel this connection to them, that we wouldn't be without them. As we know ourselves, we wouldn't exist. Marathon is like one of the very first times that this happens in history. Not only do you have an event of military significance, but the military significance speaks to this epic significance in terms of culture and history, which will echo down the generations up to the present day, right? And you can feel that in the account that they knew it was urgent and pivotal. You knew that the soldiers knew it. They knew they were deciding the fate of Greece. Herodotus knew it, and he conveys that to us. And everybody since has looked back on this and said, this was this pivotal moment. And one consequence of that is that it takes on this almost mythic character. It's like a myth that really happened. And out of it come these incredible stories, like the story of Phidippides, who is the runner that in Herodotus, he's the one who runs to the Spartans to try and get help. And, they can't because they're doing the Carnea. Later on, this story develops. It's in a bunch of classical texts, in Lucian, who's a satirist from the 2nd century AD. The story develops that what he actually did is he ran back after the battle was won, about 25 miles almost. And now, a marathon is now 26 miles, right? He runs back, tells the news in Athens, we won, and he dies. And this is why a marathon is 26 miles, right? This is we develop that out of this story of the battle at Marathon, the place. Here's the thing about this stuff, though, right? And this is why I tell this story as a way of getting into Herodotus' literary technique. At the time, it was all in living memory. The thrill and the drama of it. People lived who had been there and who had known the fear of what could have happened if the Persians had won. And they were telling those stories to each other and locally in their customs and in their rituals, I'm sure, as well. That these stories were passed down by word of mouth. And the intensity of it, not just this happened, not just we won at Marathon in this place, but the intensity of, the energy, the fear, the stakes of it, what could have happened, what didn't happen, what did, right? All of that was still alive. And Herodotus is in the tradition of what is called the logographers, which comes from logos, which is like a conversation or a speech or a word, an utterance, and grapho, to write. So they write down the spoken word. They write down the stories that people tell. And before Herodotus, there are all these different people like Hecataeus, who go around collecting these word of mouth stories. And they do it, as a way of preserving these tales people are telling. And famously, they kind of collect everything. They collect myths, legends, half-truths, full truths, right? And Hecataeus is one of the first people who tries, somewhat unsuccessfully, to kind of distinguish between those two things. We don't retain his work, but we do retain Herodotus' work. And one of the things that makes him great is that he sees this tradition of logography and understands what it's for. He realizes that the reason there's interest in preserving these stories is that they convey both the best knowledge that we have about what occurred and the kind of artistic narrative knowledge about what it meant, about how significant it was and in what ways and to whom. And so Herodotus does make an effort to distinguish fact from fiction. He says in book 7, chapter 152, he says, "I'm bound to tell what I am told, but not in every case to believe it." So he does, he gives you everything that he gets, and he travels all over. He travels to Egypt, he travels in, what is now Turkey and Asia Minor, and in Greece, and he gets all these stories from people. But at the same time, and this is what has frustrated people about him, is he seems very comfortable. We heard in that passage about the Milesians, he tells us oracles that come true. He tells us myths in book 4, chapter 191. I'm just going to read, this is a very famous passage from him, not because it tells about an event that is famous like Marathon, but because of the kind of interest of it. Book 4, chapter 191. To the west of the Triton River, and this is called, in some instances, this is called ethnography. He does this, he does these big resumes of like who people are and where they live and what their customs are. He says, to the west of the Triton River, next to the Auseans, dwell the Libyan ploughmen who possess permanent dwellings. They are called the Maxes. They wear their hair long on the right side of their heads, but shaved on the left, and they stain their bodies with red ochre pigment. These people claim to be descended from men who came from Troy. Remember Homer, right? The land here, as well as what remains of Libya to the west, has more wild beasts and woods than the lands of the nomads. The eastern region of Libya, where the nomads live, is low-lying, sandy, flat land up to the Triton River. But west of this point, the land inhabited by the Libyan ploughmen is very hilly, wooded, and teeming with wild beasts. In fact, this is where the giant serpents and the lions live, and also the elephants, bears, asps, donkeys with horns, the dog-headed creatures, and the headless beasts, which have eyes on their chests, at least according to what the Libyans say, in addition to the wild men and women, and many other creatures, which are not just fabulous inventions. So that is a lot. Like, that passage is a lot. And this is why, this interest in the sensational, in the extreme, in the unusual, and this willingness to kind of play with, well, people say this, is it true? I'm not sure. That's what makes him in the tradition of the logographers, and it is what has driven some people insane. I said he was called the father of history, but he's also, and Plutarch is the person that calls him this, he's the father of lies. Plutarch writes a whole essay on the malice of Herodotus. And so people, and the other person who really gets down on Herodotus for this is Thucydides, the second great historian of the Greek world. We'll get into that in a second. But first of all, before we get into the criticism of this method, what's the point of it? And I've already kind of hinted at it, right? Why should we still read him if he's so willing to play with, what did and didn't happen? Well, as I have said, the reason that he's going around and doing this, and the reason that he gathers all of these logoi, all of these tellings and word-of-mouth stories and traditions, and assembles them into this narrative, is not because he's unsophisticated or a chump about what's true and what isn't. It's because he's trying to get some picture of what these great events, these conflicts between the Greeks and the Persians meant. And he knows that the meaning of the event is contained in more than just the story of it. It's also contained in what people say about it and how they felt about it. And he lays this out for us in his first chapter, in the preface, which is a very, very famous, probably, I hesitate to say the most famous thing Herodotus ever wrote, but it's up there, And so this is at the very beginning of the whole work. He says, Herodotus of Halicarnassus here presents his research so that human events do not fade with time. May the great and wonderful deeds some brought forth by the Hellenes, others by the barbarians, not go unsung, as well as the causes that led them to make war on each other. Right there, short paragraph, tells you so much. First of all, the word research that's being translated there, that's historiae. And you can hear in it that it is the word history, right? We get our word history from this word which means inquiry, going around and trying to get to the bottom of what happened. And so that's one dimension, which is kind of the dimension that Thucydides will pick up and what we will come to think of as history, right? Research, figuring out what's true, getting to the bottom of it, right? But, and this is the part that we kind of lose sometimes, he also says that he doesn't want the great deeds of the barbarians and the Greeks to lose their color. The word is exitala. He doesn't want them to become faded, like paintings that have faded out of vividness. And remember I talked about enargeia, that sense that it's right there in front of your eyes. That's what he's trying to preserve. He knows that now it's in living memory, some of it. But as time goes by, he's seen how it fades away, and he doesn't want the majesty of it, the intensity of it to fade away. And the glory of the men who fought at Marathon and Thermopylae, right? He knows that it's beyond compare, but he also knows that the way that things go, the way human life works, it will fade. It will be gone if somebody doesn't get it down, somebody doesn't write it down. And so, whereas he does take, it's not true that he doesn't take any efforts to distinguish fact from fiction, but he also thinks that the fiction and the narrative and the story is worth writing down, and it's worth assembling all of it into his own narrative, which conveys how these events shaped Greek identity. He's not just observing Greek identity, he's participating in creating the Greek identity. The creation of the Greek identity happens, in some senses, in this book, because what he does is he takes these stories and he says, this is why these events made us the way we are. This conflict with this massive autocratic empire, the fear of obliteration and the courage of resistance, these things made us who we are. And that, more than anything, is why they're worth remembering, why they're worth celebrating. So when people get down on movies like 300, which do that celebrating, which elevate these events to larger than they were probably in real life, the people that hate the West get mad because they know that this is our lifeblood. This is how we carry on the tradition of celebration that makes us who we are. Now, you have to balance this against facticity, right? You have to balance this against a hard look at what did and didn't happen. And we get that impulse from Thucydides, who is the younger contemporary of Herodotus. And he writes about the Peloponnesian Wars, as we said. And we talked about him when we did the Peloponnesian War with Victor Davis Hanson. And Thucydides would excoriate Herodotus for all of this, but especially for writing stuff. One important feature of Herodotus that we haven't talked about is that he would deliver his work as speeches in front of live audiences. And some of the parts of his work seemed like they were, set pieces that he would deliver as a way of advertising his work and letting people know about it and all this stuff. And Thucydides is incredibly annoyed by this. In Book 1, chapter 22 of his histories, Thucydides says, this is not something that I wrote so that people would clap for me, so that people would listen to me and clap for me. I wrote this as a ktema sia, which is Greek for a possession for all time. Yeah, this is this thing. And he believes that permanence comes from this objective, clear vision of exactly the truth. And now, this distinction can be overemphasized because Thucydides does still indulge in a little bit of speculation about the gods and so forth, but that's perhaps a conversation for another day. The main idea is that this Herodotean emphasis on color and drama is kind of rejected by Thucydides, and we, in some sense, are all Thucydideans. We kind of have this idea that history is just the facts, Jack. And, we have lost in that. We have lost the sense that even if we want to take one thing and say, the narrative of events is history, we've lost the reality that you can never do what people always say. You can never separate fact from value entirely. This is kind of a mistaken dichotomy. That on the one hand, you have just this objective, bare bones, what happened. And on the other hand, you have your feelings about it and your ideas about it and your interpretation of it. But here's the thing, right? First of all, as has been often pointed out, you have to pick certain facts to tell. And so there are values implied in that already. But even more than that, you can't actually tell the full history of something like, say, the Holocaust without passing judgment on it. You can't talk about Auschwitz. You can't talk about the suffering and the wanton destruction and the satanic carelessness and hate for human life that goes on there, or in the gulags of the Soviet Union, right? Without talking about the specific kind of evil that was involved, the values behind it, the motivations for it. And so to lose that character is to lose all of, or not all, but a huge portion of what it was, of what the real history was. And this is one reason why memoirs are really important. If you read a book like Night by Elie Wiesel, then you get this, it's a story about what actually happened during the Holocaust, but it's also filtered through this human consciousness that gives you the color of it, the horrible, the dreadful suffering that was involved and just the pain of it, right? Memoirs are a good way of tapping into some of that logography that Herodotus wants to give us. And it's an important part of history. It's not just it's not just squishy stuff. It's like actually central to the way that we tell the stories of the past. I mentioned this when we talked about C.S. Lewis. Here's this passage in Out of the Silent Planet, right? When you and I met, the meeting was over very shortly. It was nothing. Now it is growing something as we remember it. What it will be when I remember it as I lie down to die. What it makes in me all my days till then. That is the real meeting. The other is only the beginning of it. That's a passage I come back to again and again because it gets at something about the fact that memory conveys to us truths about an event beyond the facts of its having happened. All of this brings me to Thermopylae and to 300, which is about the Battle of Thermopylae. I'm going to give you just the bare bones, very, very bare bones facts of Thermopylae before I read a little bit of Herodotus and then tell you about, how I think the movie works in relation to that narrative. So way back in 491, right before Marathon, right before the first invasion, the Persians sent out emissaries to demand tribute of earth and water, and that conveys subjugation. That means you own us. And once you give that, it's a kind of symbol that you are under Persian rule, and you enter into their bureaucracy, which has some benefits. You can benefit from their exceptional organization. You can be kind of part of this massive world domination project. However, in Herodotus Book 7, Chapter 133, we are told that in Athens, they put those emissaries on trial and threw them into a pit. And in Sparta, they just straight up kicked them down a well. So we know how Athens and Sparta responded to this embassy, right? They said, there's your earth and water. And this is kind of witty on their part, right? Take your earth and water at the bottom of this well. This was all part of the lead up to Marathon. Marathon happens. Darius is rebuffed. Xerxes, in order to avenge his father, and also because he has his own sort of hubris and plans for world domination, and Herodotus suggests a little bit of interference from the gods, this kind of dream that he has, he gathers this enormous army, and he's going to subjugate Greece. He's going to make them pay. Now, this army makes its way across the Hellespont, which is this, stretch of water in between Asia Minor and what will eventually become mainland Greece. They head southward. They're marching to erase Sparta and Athens off the map the way they did with the Milesians. Once again, this happens during the Carnea. And now this is something, so often Sparta is called a monarchy or a diarchy because they have two kings. But actually, and Plutarch tells us this in his Life of Lycurgus. Lycurgus was the person that had kind of set up in the 7th century BC, had set up there. Plutarch tells us in his Life of Lycurgus, who's the 8th century lawgiver who kind of sets up what will eventually, semi-legendary, but sets up what will become the Spartan regime. It's kind of like a mixed regime. It has this oligarchic element, which is the ephors. It has this representative democratic element, which is the Senate and a gerousia, a council of elders. And it has this diarchy, these two kings at once. And so you can have multiple elements acting in the Spartan state, but remember that the Carnea is still very important for them. And so they've had this problem already at Marathon. At Thermopylae, there's this prophecy, and I'll read now from chapter 220 of book 7 of Herodotus. The Spartans had consulted the oracle about the war at its very outset, and the Pythia had told them that either Lacedaemon, that's Sparta, would be depopulated by the barbarians, or their king would die. She answered them in these hexameter verses. For you who dwell in the vast land of Sparta, either your city of glory will perish, sacked by the Perseids, or else the boundaries of Lacedaemon will grieve for the death of a king, born of Heracles, since neither bulls nor lions have enough might to oppose him. For the power of Zeus is his possession, and he, I declare, will not be restrained until one or the other is torn apart. This is kind of in the back of the Spartans' minds as their king, Leonidas, who comes to the throne sort of unexpectedly, but is beloved, is mighty. He sort of wonders whether to go. And what he ends up doing, this is at chapter 205, he takes his hippes, his bodyguard, his personal royal bodyguard of 300 men, and he picks ones with living sons, so that Sparta won't be going to war during the Carnea, but also it won't be depopulated. And what that tells us is he believes this is a suicide mission. So talk about bravery in the face of an encroaching force, right? They know they're going to their deaths. And they're joined along the way by various contingents, other cities, up to about 7,000 people. And the Persians also make their way to Thermopylae. So this is called, Thermopylae means the hot gates. It's in the north, and the Persians have to get through it because it's this coastal pass as they're coming southward. And so it's this place where they can kind of bottleneck them and face them off. And it's named because it has these sulfur springs, just the hot gates. And they mount this incredible defense for 3 days. They hold them off. Ephialtes, who's a Trachinian, he tells the Persians about this secret route around the back way. They have this other way to attack. They attack the Spartans. Persians, at last, on this third day of magnificent fighting, they overwhelm the Spartans. This is the narrative that Herodotus gives us, Book 7, chapter 223. At sunrise, Xerxes poured libations and then waited until about the time of peak market hour to make his attack. That is what Ephialtes had told him to do, since the way down the mountain was quicker and the ground they had to cover much shorter than the climb up and around the mountain. Xerxes' men advanced, but so did the Hellenes with Leonidas, and since the latter were marching to their death, they now ventured much farther than they had at first onto the wider part of the strip of land, for on the preceding days they had been guarding the defensive wall and had kept back to fight at the narrower part. Now, however, they joined battle beyond that sector. Many of the barbarians fell, for the leaders of the regiments were behind them with whips, flogging each and every man and urging them ever forward. This is this depiction, right, of the unfree men, right, who are being led by fear. And this comes up. Herodotus has Xerxes talk to the Spartan king Demaratus about, why did the Spartans fight? Well, they fight for love of their freedom and their laws, and the Persians fight out of fear. And so many fell into the sea and died, but even more were trampled alive by one another. There was no counting the number of the dead. The Hellenes knew they were about to face death at the hands of the men who had come around the mountain, and so they exerted their utmost strength against the barbarians with reckless desperation and no regard for their own lives. By this time, most of their spears had broken, so they were slaying the Persians with their swords, and it was during this struggle that Leonidas fell, the man who had proved himself the most valiant of all, and with him those other famous Spartans whose names I have learned because I think they also proved themselves to be worthy men. Indeed, I have learned the names of all 300 of them. Many Persians fell there too, including some famous ones. In particular, 2 sons of Darius. He goes on and makes this list of Persians who've died. 2 brothers of Xerxes also fell there while they were fighting in the melee over the body of Leonidas, for the Persians and Lacedaemonians engaged in a violent struggle over the corpse until the Hellenes, after routing their opponents 4 times, managed with great valor to drag it out and away from the crowd. The fighting continued until the forces with Ephialtes arrived. The Hellenes learned they had come. The contest took a different turn as they retreated back to the narrow part of the road, and after passing the wall, all of them except for the Thebans stationed themselves together upon the hill that is located at the place on the road where the stone lion in honor of Leonidas now stands. This is their last stand, yeah. On this spot, they tried to defend themselves with their daggers if they still had them, or if not, with their hands and their teeth. The barbarians pelted them with missiles, some running up to face the Hellenes directly and demolishing the defensive wall, and others coming to surround them on all sides. And so this is the last-ditch effort, the doomed suicide mission of the 300 at Thermopylae. Unbelievable, impossible to imagine the courage that it took to do that thing. And so, why does Herodotus sit down or travel around to write this, right? What's the point of this? Well, it is one of the larger-than-life titanic events of history that really happened and yet has this mythic quality to it. And Herodotus would be remiss if he didn't convey some of that to us using the stories that people tell about it. And out of the history of Thermopylae come more stories. This, for example, is where molon labe comes, this Greek phrase meaning come and take them. And this is Plutarch, again. Plutarch, by the way, I've mentioned him a couple times. He's writing around the 1st century AD. He's kind of essayist, and he writes the Apophthegmata Laconica, the Spartan sayings. And he says, when Xerxes wrote to them to send over their arms, they responded, molon labe, come and take them. This is what this text exists to do. It exists as a marker and a commemoration of what this meant to people and how it shaped the Greek consciousness and made possible the flourishing of Greek culture that would become, one of the great originary moments of the West. This high classical period comes into being as the Greeks shape their consciousness, understanding who they are by learning that they would do this, that they would die to slow even just to slow the Persians down. This was a way of forming their own identity, to realize in the heat of battle that this is what they do. This is how much they loved their freedom and they loved their laws, right? This is, and when people take them to task for being like racist or something, for opposing the Persians, it's like, yeah, were you there? Like they were there and they knew that they would be enslaved. They would be taken over by this encroaching horde. So it's not about like how evil they were. This was not right in the eyes of the Spartans, and they would stand and die rather than give tribute and be subjugated. And that moment, that testing point, stood forever in their memory as a story about who they were, and a true story about who they were, the truth of which was contained not only in the facts of what happened, but in the stories that would be told, the legends that would be told again and again about Leonidas. And remember that this is at the end of the movie 300, they record something that is exactly true, which is from chapter 228 of Herodotus, book 7, that there is an inscription over where these men fell, right? They were buried where they fell, and there's an inscription that says, here 4,000 from the Peloponnese once fought 3 million. That inscription is for them all, but the Spartans have their own. Foreigner, go tell the Spartans that we lie here, obedient to their commands. So the movie, right? 300, based on a graphic novel, and it's Frank Miller graphic novel, Zack Snyder movie. It plays around with a lot of stuff. The E4s in particular, I think, are not very well done. The E4s get cast as these like weird, hyper-religious, inbred, crazy people. They weren't. They were just the oligarchic dimension of this mixed constitution. And even the whole, seeking of the oracle and the Carnea, that story is kind of compressed. The thing where they kick that big famous scene, This is Sparta, where they kick the guys into the pit, right? That didn't happen right before Thermopylae. As I mentioned, it happened 491, happened way back then. But they do that because it's a movie. And in this movie, they are conveying to you the heightened glory of what this moment was. And they're preserving for this generation. This is the next generation, this many hundreds year long history of preserving the glory of this moment. And each generation needs it told afresh in new ways for them. 300 is our version of it. That's why they hate it. They don't hate it because it's, inaccurate. They don't hate it because it's white supremacist, only except that they think that white supremacy means any celebration of the greatness of the West, which is nonsense. It's pure stupidity, right? The truth of it is got nothing to do with race and everything to do with who we are and how we understand ourselves. Who are we? We are heirs of the 300. We're heirs of the Battle of Thermopylae. We are those who knew who we were when we stood up against seemingly millions of people and said, we will be free or die. Hold on to that. That is not a white supremacist thing. That's what I'm giving to you today from Herodotus. It matters. It's tremendously important. It's got nothing to do with jingoism or racism and everything to do with what the West is. The mailbag. Somebody asked me what the best American novels are. And this is an interesting question because, and one thing, the reason that I picked this question is there's something I want to note, which is we think of our founding and our early history in this country as something that happened so long ago that all the great stories about it must already have been written. But when you think about like the great story of the founding of Rome, it's the Aeneid, it's Virgil. Virgil writes in the Augustan period, which is hundreds of years after Rome's founding. So it may well be, we are a young republic, it may well be that our great works of art, especially our great works of patriotic art celebrating our founding period, have yet to be written. So we shouldn't give up on American culture as like all the greats have already been written. I really think that's wrong. And I argued for that at some length in the previous episode about the Maltese Falcon, that actually, like, I think the great American contribution to the arts, many of the great contributions at least, are still to come. I won't pick the great American novels because that's a long debate, and I will tell you my favorite of the great novels, because I think there's a fairly, comprehensive, not easy, but a fairly uncontroversial list that you could write of the great American novels. It would have Faulkner and Hemingway on it, and it would have Steinbeck and all these people. But I'm going to note for you a couple that I think get too little play, and it's not going to be Moby Dick. I like Herman Melville. We'll do episodes on him, but I do not just go gaga for him the way that some people do. The one that I think is probably the greatest American novel yet written is Steinbeck's East of Eden. And everybody reads The Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck. Very wonderful. And of Mice and Men, of course. Those are both wonderful. But East of Eden is one of the best kind of American repurposing of biblical epic, of the dynastic sweep of the biblical stories. If you haven't read it, I heartily recommend it. We'll certainly do an East of Eden episode at some point. So that's probably makes my top list. Then The Great Gatsby, which is like almost a poem. It's so short and so perfectly compact and deals with many of the themes that we talked about from a different angle in the Maltese Falcon episode. Because it deals with sort of class in America. I mean, America is a place where we think we don't have social class, but we like very much do. And so that kind of is one of the interesting neuroses that people deal with. Faulkner, Light in August. This is, again, most people read The Sound and the Fury. I think Light in August, or maybe Absalom are kind of his great novels. So that's my kind of short list of the ones that really stick with me. And I will defend all of those over the course of this show, I'm sure. But note also that really my answer to the question is, I think that the great American art has yet to be made, and that when we accomplish our revival, as we certainly shall, I believe strongly, when we revive and are refounded in the way that we have been from time to time, Lincoln, I believe, was a kind of refounding, and we have to refresh always our ideals again and again. When that happens, I think we'll see a flourishing of great American art, and may it come quickly. Thanks for listening to this episode. If you like this show, you will love the Claremont Institute and the work that we do there, Claremont Review of Books, and The American Mind. And especially if you'd like to support us, please go ahead and go to claremont.org/donate. This is a great time to support the work of think tanks, especially like Claremont, patriotic think tanks, but especially Claremont, which I believe is the foremost intellectual center for the study of the American ideals. So go ahead and donate. Tell them in the notes that we sent you from Young Heretics. See you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.